Okay, in this podcast, we're going to be talking about why the right is wrong on immigration. Now, we're going to have to basically break it down into a few different points because we're going to have to look into each individual part as if it were its individual point. Now, first of all, with it is we're going to have to look at each individual section, and we're going to have to actually look into each individual area as its own individual point. And we're going to basically be using, obviously, criminal and economic data. We're going to have to be using economics in itself. We're going to have to be using history, and we're going to be using philosophy. Now, the philosophy we're going to be using is we're going to have to be using going back to obviously the foundation of the country, what they actually meant. And we're going to have to be, that means we're going to have to be going back to the founders, not necessarily people later on down the road that had different ideas on immigration, because that would be erroneous. Just like when you look into the ideas on a business, you don't look into the modern CEO on the business of this original point of why the business was constructed. You look into its original founders to why the business was constructed. Same way, you need to look into the country and its ideas. And things don't change when it comes down to that. Now, when we start to look into the ideas of this onto the immigration, what we need to look into first of all is one of their arguments is they tend to argue that one of the points I've heard commonly is immigrants coming over the border, what the term is illegally with it. Now we'll actually refute this point. Now and they'll with that point we'll get to that a little bit later. But they're saying immigrants coming over are actually an invasion. Now, the term of an invasion would actually be an actual country actually doing so. Now, they would actually have to have some type of thing of where these are actual members of either a terrorist group trying to basically overthrow the country, or B, they would have to be members of the actual country. Neither of which they know that they can actually prove. Why do we know this? Because they're unarmed. How can they actually do anything if they're unarmed? They're not. This isn't an invasion. If they're going to invade someplace with it, they're going to be armed with some type of weaponry, none of which are actually armed. So if they're not armed, it's not an invasion. And when you tend to bring this up with it, and this is one of the points, but another point is bring up kind of a philosophy of the idea of viewing the idea of the pile of sand with it. When you tend to take one grain off with it, at what point is it a pile of sand? Well, this is the same idea. At what point with it, how many do they declare as an invasion? Is it one? Because if it's like, let's say 10,000 with it, is it what it called? You can keep removing down into it until you get down to one. Is one person an invasion? And they can't compare that with it. Then and they would have to compare if people coming over unarmed, it would have to be equal to the same point as any type of movement of people going, no matter in which location, even if it's a semi-autonomous area. So when you would have a group of people going from a semi-autonomous area from one point to another, that would have to be declared as an invasion. That would be like people from, let's say, Illinois going down to Florida on a vacation, down to Disney World. That would have to be declared as an invasion. But wait, that would be what it called, that's nearly just tourism. And that actually benefits Florida with it. Well, that actual point essentially refutes their case. And then it makes them have to actually say, well, what's the actual motivation of these people? Well, if their motivation is merely to basically make their lives better, to work, well, that's not an invasion. All they want to do is make their lives better with it, and they're not acting as a group. They're merely acting as individuals. That's not what an invading group does. They're not acting as an actual group. They're acting individually. And this is where their actual point actually gets refuted. And when you tend to bring these up with it, is they tend to always want to view this with it. They always want to view this point with it because it's it's one of the few points that they think that they can rely upon. And the reason why they want to go to this point is because what I'll bring up with it is when we tend to view the Constitution, because here's what they want to do. They want to tend to view the Constitution. And when you view the Constitution in itself, you'll actually find out that, and this is one of the things that people on the right don't want to accept, when you view the Constitution in itself, there is no actual government authority for immigration. There is for naturalization. On naturalization, there's actually a definite different definition. And naturalization is actually people who actually immigrate here. There is the actual process of them becoming a citizen. Naturalization is far different. It's not the same definition. And I've even heard people even try to stretch that to mean that. And even to actually go into saying that the equal protections rights was referring somehow to mean that the federal government had rights over restricting immigration, which it doesn't. It's just equal protections of every person. It does not give rights over that. That's one of the most insane arguments I've actually seen from one person. So when we see that the federal government has no rights over this, well, where do they actually declare this to begin with? This is actually under the Commerce Clause, basically the most overused and the most abused clause in the Constitution. The Commerce Clause was originally to make sure that states were not charging each other when moving goods from state to state. If one state refused to charge tax with it, you could not actually charge a tax when moving across that state. And that was the whole point. And all sales should be based on the original sales point for it. If they did not want to charge at that point, then they wouldn't. And if there wasn't with it your own home state in which they were transferring goods with it, it would be illegal for them. Actually, not illegal, I should say unconstitutional for them to charge tax in their own home state. That would be unlawful. Because of that, it would be unconstitutional for that state to do so. That would be against the Commerce Clause. Now, obviously, the Commerce Clause is not being applied in that way with it because they don't want to do it because they want to try to suck as much money out. And that means the Commerce Clause is being wrongfully applied. It's being applied in a complete backwards way. And it's been used for justifications to restrict immigration, to restrict, it's also been used for the war on drugs as well. And these are things that it has no business being applied to. This is not what it's meant for. It's meant to actually streamline the movement of goods from within the country. It's so that basically so that you do not have protectionism from state to state. And that was what was meant to stop protectionism, to stop states from charging other states tax on their own goods. That if one state that any interstate sales with it, if the state of sale was not charging tax, that the state that was receiving goods would not be allowed to charge tax. And that was the way that it was actually done. And that's merely what the Commerce Clause was meant. Well, what they've actually done is they've abused it. And this is going back in history. And the first Immigration Act was with the Chinese Exclusion Act because the Chinese were far more efficient than United States workers. So this is the idea of protectionism. And this was done under the Commerce Clause. Because they thought because it would affect the United States workers, they felt that they needed to restrict the amount of Chinese workers coming in to help on the railways. And that's where it started out. They felt that worked into somehow the commerce of the United States. And it was a very, very wide viewing of the actual law or the actual constitutional statement. And it essentially should have been stricken down. And if we actually view it as the Constitution as written and as the original intention was with the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause has nothing to do with protectionism. Protectionism was never intended within the country. If people want protectionism, they can go out to some Marxist state or some other nationalist state. That's not what is actually meant within the United States. The United States was meant to be a free and open country. And it's why we've actually fallen as an actual nation because of this. And when we start to view it, well, we need to go back to the another thing in history with it, and this is one thing that really tends to irritate a lot of people on the right, is going to the ideas with it, is our founders, specifically people like Thomas Jefferson, believed in the free movement of people. And he not only did he believe this, he actually physically engaged in this with his travels around the world. And this shows you, and we saw that basically our government did not limit him saying that he had to come back within 3 months of it as we do now. And nowadays with it, we find this specific to our actual thing with it, that our immigration policy actually swings both ways. Not only does it impact the people that are trying to come into the country, both through travel, through business, through things like migrating here to create a better life. It also creates things like people trying to exit on travel, on business, people trying to go elsewhere on trying to maybe get a job elsewhere in the world. And basically it's because of protectionism. They want to basically lock people in. And it's basically, and this is what ends up happening because of it. And this is something in which has been created. And the best analogy I guess I could create with this is it's the same idea as a prison. They don't put up prison walls to basically stop people from going in and visiting. They put up prison walls to keep people from leaving. And these prison walls are meant to keep people in, not to stop people from leaving. Or if you keep people in, not to stop people from visiting, I should say. And this is the very, very same thing as with the same idea of us creating a wall on the southern border. We actually wanted to have if we wanted to stop all immigration, and even all immigration from the south, we would actually create a border on the south and a border on the north. Why is this the case with it? Because Canada still accepts a lot of people in, and as they've actually upped their number of accepting people in since Donald Trump wanted to do these restrictionist policies. They've actually stated that they're willing to accept anybody that gets blocked by the Trump administration. Canada stated that they are willing to accept them up there. That meant that they were legal residents up there, and they can essentially cross in the United States with a border crossing card, which is just basically a passport card. They could cross right up there on the northern border of the United States, legally cross right over, and it'd be far cheaper than paying anybody to smuggle you across the border on the south. and being that you can legally cross right over, and then you could essentially then marry someone within the United States and do all these things to basically apply for whatever you do to apply for to apply for some type of green card. Then when you do this with entering in the United States, you could then with it become a citizen within a short period of time. And essentially those when you're talking on the political end, that could lead to those northern states that Republicans need, such as Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, that those states that are crucial, those could essentially be completely gone because they've essentially have gone against immigration. When we're talking politics, I know we're not necessarily trying to focus on that, but if they're trying to focus on that point, that's essentially what we're getting here with that. And this is something in which we can actually say that politics are going to be far more important of an issue than if they were worried about that. If they're worried, because this is another thing that I see a lot of Republican voters saying, "Oh, they'll come over and they'll vote Republican, they'll vote Democrat instead, and it'll what it calls, and that this is some type of like master plan of the Democrats." Well, the fact is it's very easy for them to basically have a far wider impact if you actually just create the southern border, because a northern border has never been discussed. The only reason it's ever been discussed is actually in a joking manner by Scott Walker. Scott Walker is actually saying to basically keep the Canadian cold weather out of the United States. And it was just basically done as a little bit of a joke. That's the only type of time has ever been discussed, meaning that there is no actual function to this. Now, when we start to look at the actual economics of this, they tend to what you get a lot of Republicans saying is they tend to focus solely on the actual only on the debt side of immigrants coming in, of the creation of the debt into government. Yes, there's some debt created with it when any types of people come in. Now, we can actually, and it ends up being about, I believe the number is like 140 billion a year. Now, the problem being is that when they tend to want to complain about that, but when in about 2015, when they went into a general audit on the Pentagon, they found automatically $120 billion of waste. Now, this does not include the whole 1033 program of giving free military equipment to police departments across the United States. This does not include the materials that we actually refuse to actually sell when we actually can't transport it to back to the United States. And we could easily sell it to regional countries out there by having them transport it to their own home countries and recoup some of those costs, and we end up instead destroying them. It does not include any of these costs with it. It just actually includes just basically lost money. Either lost money or money spent on complete and utter garbage. So they end up finding 120 billion. So even just going with those with that one thing right there and eliminating that, and right there you can create an offset right there down to about 20 billion in difference with it if you just basically get rid of the waste. And all you have to do is basically say we're going to basically cut your funding down to the waste. And that's minimum right there. Then there would only be from these people coming across the border. That means that's all you would get. Now, on top of that, it does not include the actual economic benefit. Now, if we're going to basically look in things at one way with it, you can actually look at the economic benefit. Now, the revenue generation on these people with it is massive. We can actually look at immigration as being a huge benefit. Hispanic and Asian immigrants are basically 60%, when we get new businesses, they're creating 60% of the new businesses. Basically, and those are obviously 60% of all new jobs. It's an even distribution as well. So when we're actually seeing this is actually a major point when they look economically. And when we start to look at this, these are the ones that are actually being cut off from coming into the United States. They're not having any problem with bringing in the European ones, but Europeans are actually, when we start to look actually at the data, it ends up showing that Europeans, when they migrate here as immigrants, they're actually earning less money than they were over in Europe. That means there's something wrong there. That means most likely that they're actually, many of them are coming here for the welfare state. When it comes down to things like Hispanic and Asian immigrants, they're earning far more when it comes down to here than their own home countries. That means they're not coming here for the welfare state. In fact, they're actually coming here to work. And this means there's actually a far difference between the two. You're actually better off bringing in Hispanic and Asian ones. In fact, when we start to look at it, these Hispanic and Asian ones are far the best investments to actually bring within the country out of any area. In fact, when we start to look at it, we see that Filipinos, when it comes down to them with it, they're actually one of the best investments to bring in. Yet we find a lot of bigotry against them when it comes down to bringing them into the country. We find the State Department says we don't want Filipinas here because they might marry the males. Well, that's not a problem, because for two reasons. Number one is because when they come here, they're actually one of the top 5 of amongst immigrants. They're actually one of the top 5 income earner groups. That's number one. Number two, our birth rate has actually slipped well down with it. We're actually in a danger zone of worker replacement, well below worker replacement. We're about 0.4 below worker replacement. We're actually about 1.7 right now. We actually dropped about 0.2 under Trump, and we are already at 1.9 under Obama, which is already 0.2 below where we needed to be. And Trump's immigration policies were actually already horrible to our actual system. When we find it's and that was even before the coronavirus had hit, and that was directly blamed on his immigration policies. When it comes down to it, natural citizens are not having enough children to replace the workers. We need immigrants to come in here and actually have higher amounts of kids than what we normally have to actually have that. A lot of these people are having like one kid, and some are having 2, some are having 1, and that's putting us below the actual rate that we need. And it's not going to actually help. This is something which we need to look on the economic factor. This is a major economic factor when it comes down to it. And we need to look into these things and realize that you're not going to help out the economy ever if you cannot replace the workers that are retiring. When one worker retires, for every 2 workers that retire, we only can replace it with 1.7 at this point. That means you're losing ground, and losing ground fast. This is actually one of the big concerns of even the economic status of China. This is why China is actually worried, and China realizes that they're in an actual economic problem. It's actually why China actually dropped the one-child policy, because of that actual point. They realized that even though they had a huge population, they figured that controlling the population was far less important than actually getting enough people to replace. And it's why other countries like such as Japan is actually has some economic problems, and why they actually have some pretty loose immigration standards. And you'll see a lot of countries that actually have some low birth rates that are actually pretty much having some pretty loosening up their immigration standards because of that, because they know that they need people in their country, and they're not going to solve the actual issue just by basically shutting down their borders, which is only going to make their country go down further into economic drought. And if you look at, we can actually look at another economic number, which is basically the more we shut down immigration, the higher our debt per GDP goes up. We basically, in our history with it, we've only had a couple of eras in which we've actually had protectionism really come in on where we shut down immigration. And basically these periods, I would say, are between about 2001 to current, which is like the 9/11 era to current, and also the progressive era back in the later 1800s to about the end of the 1940s. And what we found is that basically when we start to look at those debt numbers were soaring. And it's not uncommon with it. It's because the fact is Americans are going to vote for more and more debt, and then the politicians are going to vote for more and more war, specifically in those eras, in the modern era. So to actually stop this and to get the actual debt to go down, you actually need more domestic economic growth, and people to actually vote. A lot of these individuals who believe that war is profitable, which it isn't. War is destructive, and to believe that the government spending is a good thing. The only way you're going to get it is by getting in a new group of people coming from countries that are naturally frugal. The United States is not a frugal country. Never has been since the progressive era, and probably never will be again. You look at just the way we actually spend. We actually max out credit cards with it. We max out debts. We actually look for asset prices to go up, even though there's no actual legitimacy to it when we're not actually adding value to it. This is not exactly a country in which frugality actually exists. Countries that actually where frugality exists with it, these are countries with debt to GDP ratios below 100%. And these are the ones in which we found Donald Trump insulting those countries and saying how bad those countries were. Saying, basically insulting the people, insulting everything about their lives. And these are people that basically know how to save their money. And what's going to happen? And these are these countries that always tend to take advantage of these situations when there's economic problems in the world, and they always tend to rise back up the fastest. And in fact, with it, they often tend to rise higher than they were before. And this is why when we start getting back to the immigration issue with it, we find that it's economically beneficial to bring people who are frugal, who are job creators into the country. When this is why what they to this idea of as if there's some type of culture beyond our actual foundation documents is absurd with it. Because if you look at our foundation documents, we had basically one of our founders is Jefferson. Jefferson was basically believed in what he called taking the best of the world and importing it, and importing all these ideas and into our actual culture. This is how we kind of got to where we were. Restricting that down and having some white bread culture is not consistent with the United States and what makes it great. There's reasons why the United States became great, and that's because we've taken in the best ideas of the world, and we want to import those. Let the best ideas win. Restricting that is the most absurd ideas with it, and it goes against the full idea of the Constitution, specifically the First Amendment. Let everything pass through. Don't restrict with it because it makes your argument weak. Now, some of the other arguments I've seen with it is, if we get rid of this border wall and we let the free movement of people exist, you're going to have terrorism. I hate to tell people, but this goes back to this is going to a historical argument, but terrorism goes back to 1 AD. And for those who don't know, the country was founded well after 1 AD. Any enhanced amount of terrorism is only going to be created from intervention. The more we intervene, the more we're actually going to basically create more terrorism existing. Terrorism is basically created around the world when we basically intervene. So it's not truly terrorism per se. It's actually reactionary situations to what the United States and what Europe is doing around the world. And that we're intervening, we're basically trying to say that our way of life is better, using essentially what's considered the liberal foreign policy perspective. That liberal foreign policy perspective has actually created an extreme explosion around the world of what has actually been relatively a pretty much a peaceful world. Usually there's not much negative interaction. The more negative interaction that we do with it, the more countries tend to want to fire back at each other. While there might be certain eras in which you will find where one country might be intervention, where one movement might want to be interventionist, as you can basically easily try to repel those. But when it comes down to it, is historically with it, when every country is able to live with autonomy and basically live with the ideas of Jefferson, where Jefferson said to be friendly with all nations and have alliances with none, what ends up happening is it makes a lot more a safer world, that everybody's able to be on the same level. And this is something which really goes back to the situation of defeating the idea of terrorism and as actually being a problem. In fact, terrorism is actually pretty much a negligible issue with it, even when it was being talked up as such a major issue, because there are so many other things that could actually kill you, even with your own home country. In fact, most often with it, there's authoritarian ideas within your home country that are far more dangerous, that actually technically would qualify as terrorism and not blowback from intervention. Very rarely is there ever terrorism globally of what is actually considered as the actual dictionary definition of terrorism. Terrorism is using violence to gain some type of political movement, either domestically or either like regionally or globally. Now, it could be even like in a religious way with it. A caliphate would be an actual form of terrorism, but very rarely does it actually become to where it becomes a threat to many countries, specifically in the West. Most often, it becomes regional. Specifically, like ISIS was only regionalized to Africa, the Middle East, and situations out in Southeast Asia. It was not an actual problem through Europe or into the Americas. You might have one individual here or there with it, but that was actually through importing these actual problems and that were created by intervention. And actually, ISIS in itself was actually a product of intervention in Iraq. They would not have existed had we not intervened, brought one of the guys back to Gitmo that ended up getting radicalized there at Gitmo and then releasing him back out. That then created ISIS in itself. So when it comes down to it, that was actually the whole point with it, that anytime we find these interventions, when you have to go back to the last one, it would be like the Ottoman Empire. And there's basically, for people alive today, there's not many globally that have been alive within that era. And if they were with it, they were little kids. And that's the whole point. They were basically little kids when that was actually occurring. As opposed to, like, let's say, for example, the things which would actually be considered terrorism within many domestic countries. Now, there's terrorism in domestic countries that even still happen to this day in the West. And that's actually happening with it within, you might find on the left being from socialism or communism, and on the right being from nationalism. And those are serious threats that would be classified as terrorism. But it's not going to be this idea of importing things with it. The other thing with it would be the idea of as if gangs were coming over. Let me explain, or these cartels coming over. Let me explain it like this. When you have a country like, let's say, for example, Mexico, El Salvador, any of these other things with it, they're not going to be weak because you have gangs always have rivals. You're not going to have one gang weaken the amount of forces and send enough people coming over into another foreign country, and which has rival gangs there, which will actually try and kill them, just for the purpose of potentially maybe getting a small bit more territory. That would be low risk, that would be low reward, high risk. This is not what is occurring. At best with it, you might find a dumping of a body with it over a border with it, just basically to limit the ability to get caught. That's about it. You're not going to find anything happening like people that are actually going into other regions that are actually happening. You might find one or two people here or there, but it's not going to be like this huge flood of gang activity. You're not going to find any establishment there. The reason why, because it's too detrimental to an actual gang to actually take a huge flood of all their people and move them to a new location. Because once they do that, they're risking their actual home location from being decimated. This is just logic. This would be like essentially if they found out that there was some type of like nationalist based terror attack out in Portland. So the Washington D.C. sent all their Capitol Police, or let's say half of their Capitol Police, out to Portland. Well, that means that basically that maybe another nationalist group could attack the Capitol again, and now they have half of the police to defend it, or half of the National Guard there that would be available to defend it. This is just absurd. It's the same way works with it. They're not going to basically deplete their forces. And it's just the way it ends up working. And this is why we end up seeing this. And it's just going with logic. You don't end up moving a huge amount of people with it and then end up losing all the ground you end up gaining. That's why what they do, they don't want to actually lose the whole area that they got, because you're going to have so many rivals coming in trying to steal that area. The whole idea with it when it comes to gangs with it is due to the global drug war, which is the dumbest thing possible. What ends up happening is territory is very, very important. And it's more important to protect your territory than to try to advance new territory. Because if you end up losing that territory, you're going to you could be completely wiped out and your gang's completely gone. And when you're wiped out, that means that means your high-end people are going to be killed. No one's going to be left. And that's it. Because it's not going to be the cops arresting anyone. It's going to be a rival gang killing every one of your people. Especially the top, and there's going to basically start executing one by one by one by one. And this is the whole point. So the idea of saying, oh, there's these drug cartels from Mexico or El Salvador coming over the border, not happening. And there's nobody coming over that's in a collective manner. These are individuals coming over. It's not some horde. Not some horde invasion. It's individuals coming over. We've already gone over the fact that the whole idea on free movement. Now we need to go over the Constitution. Now, since we said that there's no actual, we need to go with the idea that there's no actual authority on the thing with it. We've gone over the fact that basically on that of what's added in the debt and how the debt can actually be offset. Now they always. Now, when it comes down to it, the fact is that if we tend to follow the Constitution per as written with it, you're going to see that basically that the free movement of people is actually what's written in the Constitution. That's why when it comes down to immigration was never actually given its actual right. The executive does not have the authority to go over anything with it, nor does the legislative. There's no actual illustrated thing in the Constitution. These are merely made-up powers. And this is where we tend to go to not only both the Republicans, but also the Democrats. They think like they can do comprehensive immigration reform. There is no comprehensive immigration reform. What needs to happen, actually, and this is where we start to go to the actual solution, is they just need to go to the Supreme Court, explain this, basically say that every immigration law to date needs to be nullified because there is no actual authority, neither in the executive nor in the legislative branches, nor does any state have any authority over this, because this would essentially be essentially a violation thereof for the free movement of people between states. You cannot restrict people moving from state to state. This is the basic concept of the Commerce Clause as well, where you cannot restrict free movement of people between state to state. And within this, all legislation ever passed should be null and void. There is no reason for ever having any type of immigration law if it's not constitutional. It doesn't matter if people think that there's some type of defense reason. We can come up with some type of, obviously we can come up with some type of like border crossing type of system in which you'd have to provide a passport, a health background check, and a health check and a background check from your local version of the FBI. But beyond that, there should be no reason for this. And this is basically it. And we could actually get this done if the right was willing to actually look at this. But what the right wants to do is try to score these political points with this is where it goes into some other points, is where they feel that they should stop people from actually coming in, because it would change what they consider the quote-unquote culture of the United States. There's no actual culture of the United States. There's no actual quote-unquote what we would call American people or people of America. There's no that isn't a thing. There's no actual American food. It's all basically what people have brought here and basically tending to adapt to the actual climate and growing abilities to actually adapt that, and basically working with what the land gives off. But if you look at what we've had with it, everything basically what we've had is basically mixing in a mix of Oceania, Pacific Islands, obviously the people that were already here, the Native Americans are already here. You have mixing in with Asia. You have mixing in with the Hispanic regions. You have mixed like South America, Central America, and parts of the Hispanic areas of North America. You have the Caribbean mixing in. You have Africa coming in. You have Europe, the Middle East. You have and then you have all areas of Asia coming in that have basically created what we have today. There is no actual quote-unquote American cuisine. It's all a conglomeration. There's nothing uniquely American. This is the whole point. And there is nothing uniquely American out there. Beyond basically our documents, there's nothing uniquely American about our culture. Beyond our documents and obviously what we've tried to basically adopt from the best ideas of the world, that's pretty much it. So our actual quote-unquote culture is accepting the best ideas of the world through an actual debate and basically historic documents. Those historic documents aren't going anywhere. We could actually do a hell of a lot better job of defending them, but actually bringing more people in is actually going to make the country better. You're going to have more robust debate. This is what is going to make the country better. And in fact, if Republicans want to get more conservative, you need to get more people from countries with the debt ratios in their countries that are below 100%. Saying you want people from Europe because they look like you is not going to do it, because those countries have those debt ratios far too high, and they're not and they don't really have the same values of the documents that we have with it anyway. And in fact, that they're not going, and many of them, they don't believe in ideas of natural rights. A lot of them believe in these ideas of what we would call in our Constitution privileges. And this is something in which we've seen the Democratic Party evolve into. And you're not going to find this ever get any better unless we actually come out to the point of actually bringing in countries that are actually far more frugal. And until we actually do this, you're not going to find anything like that. And this is why we need to go with these refreshers with these things. Now, I'm basically going to cut it here because we're a little over 50 minutes. I think I've gone over like the philosophy of the idea. I think we've gone over the history. I think we've gone over the economics on the things. I think we've gone over the actual things when it comes down to crime with it. When we look at crime with it, I mean, you can look at the data on everything. You can actually see that immigrants actually, when you start to look at the data, you can see they actually commit less crime than native-born citizens. Even when you start to look at the data with it, in a general sense with it, you can see Hispanics are equal on homicide as whites. You can see, and this is FBI statistics that have been going around for a while. You can see basically Asians are far below whites. You can, so when it comes down to that, this is basically what's happening. You can see basically most of the homicides in this country are basically a product of pretty much the war on drugs. And that's basically what's going on. And obviously, if you want to basically get anecdotal stuff, you can get anecdotal stuff every day. And we can basically have a fight over anecdotal stuff. And I can find anecdotal stuff all day long with it. But the fact is, when you want to actually go after real statistics, you can actually see that immigrants only make the country better. And it's why the United States has actually excelled in everything. It's why when it comes down to things like the Olympics, why we've actually excelled and why they've actually tried to put restrictions on the United States over other countries, because the United States has killed everyone else in every area, because we have this whole pool of people that have come from around the whole world, so we can access this whole large pool of people. Now, if we just basically want to basically make this ethno-state, we're going to be no better than the average country in the world, and we're going to basically be finishing in the middle of the pack. And that's what's going to happen. To excel and be at the top, you need to actually look for people around the world that are at the top. That's how things happen. Now I'm going to obviously cut it here, gone over about everything with it, and I think I've proven the point with it that how immigration is basically not only the economic source to make things better with it, and to actually get better to a far lower debt per GDP, at least to slow the rate, but also creating far more jobs, but also to enrich the country when it comes down to what options you have for food and everything with it, and make it a far richer experience, which is going to make tourism a lot better. But it's also going to make tourists come here a lot more. The more you open up immigration, the more tourists are going to be able to come here and give us their money. And obviously, with it, you want more money in your pocket. And if you want more money in your pocket, I mean, if you're a conservative, you're going to want more money in your pocket. And it's only going to happen if the more you open up the country. The more the country stays closed, obviously, as we've seen, the poorer people get. It's been seen with it. If you saw with it during the progressive era, people got poorer You've seen during what it called from 9/11 to current, people have gotten poorer. This is because of shutdown in immigration. It's not because of some things like people try to blame it on NAFTA. NAFTA had no problem with it. It might have been a crony type of deal with it, but it's still extended trade. It was because of shutdowns in immigration. Immigration makes people richer. It always does. Immigration and free trade, two of the things that actually make the world actually wealthy. You want actual free movement of people, free movement of goods, and free movement of ideas. The three things that actually make the world actually, number one, peaceful, and number two, prosperous. And that's basically about it. I'm going to end it right here and see you guys later. Bye, everyone.